All right, so here we go. Chapter 1, Foundations of Early Civilizations. Um, every time that we go into a topic in history, it's like a story. It's like a brand new opportunity to learn something new. How many of you all remember when you were younger, or maybe you still do Bible story at night or in Sunday school? And your Sunday school teacher would open up that Bible story, or your mom or dad would open up that Bible story, and they'd explain to you something. And how many of you had a favorite Bible story growing up? Okay? Most of you did. So this is something I still do with my kids. Every night we get together after they brush their teeth and get ready for bed. We sit down and we read a Bible story. Except on the weekends where we let them listen to Patch the Pirate, which most of you probably don't know what that is, but they enjoy listening to that. So we sit down, we read a Bible story. And my daughter's at that age, she's 4, she wants to be in control of the Bible story because she wants to know what happens next. And she wants to make sure that she's understanding everybody and everything that's in that story. That's kind of what we do with history, is that we examine a story and we try to find out as much as we can about it. And every well-written story progresses toward a climax. How many of you enjoy mystery or adventure-type stories when you're reading a book? Okay? Can you imagine those without a climax? If it were just a bunch of people did something, but it wasn't really that exciting, and the end. No, it needs to have something where you're left wondering what's going to happen next, or how did that happen? I missed that. A couple of my favorite movies are movies that take you on twists and turns you're not expecting. And that's exactly what we should be looking for when we're looking into history. And with our story here, as we intro and begin the foundation of early civilization, we're going to see in ancient history, the very first area here is going to build toward a climax. In steady succession, empires are going to rise and fall, each new empire appearing even greater and more extensive than the last one that we had. Finally, we'll end, hopefully with the Roman Empire, maybe just before the Roman Empire, where ancient history is going to meet its climax, but not with the empire itself, not with the Romans, but in something else. The Roman Empire provided a setting for the turning point of history. That turning point of history is the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Galatians 4:4-5 says, "When the fullness of time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law, to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons." So everything that we talk about, everything that we do, we need to be thinking ahead toward how does that lead us into the climax of history. And what is that climax? What I just say was life, death, and resurrection of Christ. Okay, we just came off of Easter, right? So we should be very familiar with the resurrection of Christ. And if that is the climax of history, then all these other events are going to help us see that event more clearly, or it's going to prepare for that event. So what you're saying, even the Egyptians and their pyramids lead up to the cross of Christ? Yes. And that's what I want us to see, and that's what I want us to investigate here. So we're going to get the first main idea here. Roman numeral 1 is the study of world history. So before we can get into some of the people, the places, the events, I'm not huge on dates. So for those of you who are thinking, oh, we got to memorize a ton of dates, I'm not big on that. There will be a few, but I'm more interested that you know a progression or a timeline. Who came first? What did they do? Why were they important? How did that lead up to this climax of history? So before we can get to some of that stuff, we need to understand why we study world history and understand the value of it. These blinds seem like they are making it more difficult for us to see over there. The value of studying history. First of all, I have to ask the question, what is history? If you had to add a definition of history, and I know some of you have my PowerPoint, so don't just read off my PowerPoint. How would you describe history? A what? Series of events throughout time. Good. Okay, how else would we describe history? The past. Yeah. How else do people describe history? Maybe it's not the way you describe it or the way my PowerPoint does, but you've heard people describe history. Anybody heard it's boring? It's old? So I did a discussion one time at a teacher convention, and I labeled it old guys, old stuff, dead guys, and worthless dates. And so it was a talk on history and how we can talk about history without having to just go through a dusty old museum or dusty old textbook. Hopefully, when you walk out of here, that's not your viewpoint. Hopefully you're not looking at it going, man, that was just really, really boring. Now, history may not be your favorite subject. I'm not expecting it to be. I'm not asking you to make it your favorite subject. But I am asking you to appreciate it and to understand it as best you possibly can. So when we look at history, let's go the correct direction here. The word history literally is translated, means inquiry. So what does that mean for us? If history means inquiry, what should we be doing? Asking questions. What happened? Okay, that's quite often the most commonly asked question in history is, well, what happened there? Where did it happen? And so that's why we studied geography and why you had to learn countries and places and locations, because we need to know where. So when I say that something happened in the Middle East, you have a general framework of knowledge to know what we're talking about there. Well, who did it happen to? Yeah, there's going to be a lot of people that you need to know. There's going to be a lot of countries, a lot of civilizations that you need to keep straight. But this, to me, is the most important question of all. Why did it happen? That's a question I love to answer. Do we always have the answer to that question? No, we don't. Why? Some of you saw what I did there. Yeah, we don't know everything. Why not? We weren't there. Yeah, none of us were back there when the Egyptians built the pyramids. So do we know how they built the pyramids? No. Okay, we've come up with some theories based off of technology, but we don't know exactly how they did it. We don't know how some of these great wonders and how these empires actually lived. We take the information that we've been given and we try to put it together and we come up with as best of ideas we can. So these are the questions you should be asking yourself when you read a particular part of the history textbook. Sometimes they'll fill you in on these questions, sometimes they won't. But that's where you come to class and you say, hey, Mr. Jones, I didn't talk about this, but why did this happen? And I will come up here and I will say, hey, that's a great question. Here's why I think it happened. Or I may say, I don't know. That's a great question. What do you guys think? And we can talk through some of that stuff. Because that to me is the best reason for, and the best way that we can understand history is by trying to understand why people did what they did. Did you realize you guys are living history right now? You guys are making your own history, and someday they may write about you in a history textbook. Maybe not, but maybe they will. You're going, man, really? Like I'm going to be a test question answer someday? Wouldn't that be cool? Get your name in a test bank? So, here's my favorite question. Why do we study history? Because it's boring, isn't it? Yeah, it's all boring. Okay, so why? Give me some ideas. Why do we study history? Matt? We don't want to repeat the same mistakes. Good. Why else?
So we understand how have we arrived
Yeah.
where we are.
Yeah, how we arrived where we are today. Why else do we study history? Okay. Explain that a little bit more for me. I'm not disagreeing with you here, but I just need a little bit more framework. Why do we study history? It's a required class. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. Appreciate y'all being here for that. What else? To build our knowledge. Yeah. Okay, can history help us to understand more about the future?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I know you guys are smart enough, and you've been around long enough. You know the phrase that if we don't learn from history, we are doomed to repeat it, right? Now, sometimes that could be a good thing. Sometimes we want to repeat history because some people did things really well. But other times we want to avoid making the same mistake. So let me ask you this question, okay? What happens if we don't read the Bible? The what? We're not going to know Bible history. Okay, we're not going to have knowledge. We're not going to be growing. We're going to be making the same mistakes as other people.
We're not going to be closer to Christ.
Right. Okay, so while I'm not going to make any comparisons, and please don't twist my words here, I'm not going to make comparisons with history class to Bible study, but similar principles do apply where if you're not reading your Bible and you're not learning from the mistakes of others, I mean, great men of God like David and Moses and Aaron and all of these guys that Noah, we're going to talk about him later this week. If we don't learn from their mistakes and avoid the same things that they did, we are doomed to repeat the same things. Read the book of Proverbs. There is so much wisdom there reminding us of what we should and should not do. So get back here to history. Why do we study history? It's boring. It does prepare us for the future. It helps us to understand where we've come from and where we're headed, to better prepare us. And you think, okay, well, how in the world can my understanding of Hammurabi's code help me to understand and make me prepared for the future? Anybody know what Hammurabi's code is, by the way? You do? Okay. Awesome. So it's a, spoiler alert here, it's a list of very strict regulations and laws that if you didn't follow, there were serious physical pain and consequences for not following. It kept society in order. So if you're not aware of Hammurabi's code and how it worked, then how are you going to prevent a similar code from being instilled in the United States of America, in which if you were caught for theft, they chopped your hand off? Well, wait, no, that would never happen in America. Well, we do a lot of things that people have said would never happen in America. Anyway, I digress. Cultural identity. Okay, we need to understand our culture, where we've come from, and who we are. It helps us understand more about the people around us as well. We talked about this in geography a little bit too, where we had to look into some of the history and culture of some of these different people and countries, and you guys did research and you did projects, understanding more about how different people live. We do the same thing in history to try to better interact with people that are around us. When we have people come to our campus from other parts of the world, we want to be able to understand a little bit about their history, understand who they are, where they've come from, so that we are not culturally insensitive, or that we can be better friends and better Christians to them. History declares God's glory as well. If you think about it this way, history is firsthand evidence of God's plan being carried out through man's actions. So when we think about the climax of history, we said was what? What's the climax of history? The life, death, and resurrection of Christ. All these events point toward that. And so all these things we see is God's working in man's life to lead him to the climax of history. And then the events afterwards, so we're living in the afterwards, all point back to the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. And we'll get into that a little bit more next year when we get into the events after the life of Christ. So as we study history, we should grow closer to God. For me, history and my relationship with God need to go hand in hand. If I'm just studying history to study history and to know more about old people, dead guys, dates, all that stuff, for me, then that's just becoming self-glorification. I want to know those things because I want to know how God is working through them, how He's working through me, and now I can glorify my Creator better because I understand more about the people that have come before me. So, as we look at the historian and his task, you guys are going to be historians for the next 8 weeks or so. We've got to look at our resources and what we are examining to understand and answer the questions who, what, where, when, why. So our first type of resource is a primary source. This would be one of those examples of, it's not going to show up on your screen, but you should write down a definition in your own terms here to describe a primary source. So these are, oh no, I'm wrong. Actually, it is going to show up on your screen, isn't it? I gave you a break on that one. Made life too easy for you. So these are records or documents. And these could be all kinds of different things. Artifacts, these could be architecture, it could be all kinds of stuff. Things that are produced in the time period, often by those who are directly involved. So when we are looking at a primary source, it is something that was, at least should be, very accurate because it was produced in the time period, often by those directly involved. Twitter is often a primary source. Maybe not a good one, but it's often presented, and it's often people are tweeting things or putting things on Facebook or Instagram that are primary sources. You look through somebody's Instagram feed, and unless they are reposting, which we'll get to that in a moment, or sharing somebody else's stuff, if it's original from them, then it would be a primary source because they were in the event and they were in that time period. Secondary source. So these are records or documents that are going to explain primary sources or explain events, but the difference here is that it's explaining something. It's not actually telling us all that happened, and it's produced by those who are not directly involved in the event. So your textbook, primary or secondary source? Secondary source, because your textbook is written by somebody who did not live in ancient Egypt. It is explaining to you what they understand about what happened in ancient Egypt. However, if we had an original copy of the U.S. Constitution, primary or secondary? Primary, okay? Because that was written by the people who lived it, who were there. So I mentioned the Twitter post a moment ago. So if it is your Twitter feed and you tweeted something about going back to school this morning, or you posted yourself on Instagram this morning, hey, first day back at spring break, yay, school, I can't wait for history class today. Pretty sure somebody did that. Catch the sarcasm. And that would be a primary source. If, however, you were scrolling through your Instagram feed and you saw that Zay had posted that, and you were like, man, that's cool. All right. And so you repost it on your timeline, on your page, you are now a secondary source. So Zay's original post where he was so excited to come to school this morning was a primary source. But you reposting or you sharing that would be a secondary source. So it's very important when we're looking at history to know whether we're dealing with a primary or secondary source. Primary sources are always more accurate. Yes, sir?
So if it's just a copy, then it's a secondary source? Even if it's like exact wording?
So if it is a photocopy, it would still be a primary source. But when I mentioned the sharing, because you are now posting that on your timeline, if I were, let's say that you shared Zay's original post, if I just saw it on your timeline, I would have to consider it a secondary source because I'm not going to the original person that posted that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So back on the back wall, I have a copy of the U.S. Constitution up above that bulletin board. That would still be considered a primary source because it is a word-for-word replica of the primary source or of the original Constitution. If, however, I brought in a pamphlet that explained what the Constitution means, that would be a secondary source, just like your textbook, secondary source. Okay, question on that? Primary, secondary? Cool. So when we are looking at the types of primary resources, there are three basic types of primary sources that we want to examine. First one is an artifact. I believe this is an area where you need to write in some stuff I did not put up on the screen. Artifacts are objects that are made by man. Objects that have been made by man. These are artifacts. Most of these things are simple everyday items. So when we look at ancient Egypt and we send a team of excavators there and they start digging up and they find a shard of pottery or they find a hand tool, those things are considered artifacts. Oftentimes they end up in a museum somewhere. We also want to look at architecture. This is still under artifacts, not tradition. I skipped ahead a little bit. So we're still under artifacts. So we have objects made by man. We can also look at architecture. So again, we'll jump into Egypt. The Egyptian pyramids would be that architecture would tell us a little bit about who these people are. The Great Wall of China is another piece of architecture that would tell us a little bit more about their country. Or perhaps the Colosseum in Rome. What about the United States? What type of architecture would we have that would tell us a little bit about who we are? Statue of Liberty, Mount Rushmore, Washington Monument, the what? Empire State Building. Good. Yeah, those are all good examples of artifacts that would be listed in architecture. Now there's a third one here. Works of art would be another artifact. Works of art are included in here as well. How many of you are really into art? Like that's one of your favorite things to do? Okay. You enjoy drawing or you enjoy painting or creating. So there are a few of you. I will tell you that's one of my weaker areas of my study of history is art. I enjoy art. I like drawing. But as far as knowing art, that's an area I'd love to do a little bit more study into. But as we study and look into art, it will help us know more about customs, the time period in which we're studying. It's pretty interesting when we get into the Middle Ages. Some of the art that's there is entirely religious. Well, that was because the only people buying and sponsoring artists were people from the Catholic Church. Yet when we jump into a couple hundred years later, we get into the Renaissance, and now people have money, and so private individuals start paying people to paint their family portrait. And they don't want to paint them dark and dreary. They want to paint them very robust, very prominent. There's a lot of things we can learn from art. Let's talk tradition. Okay, so tradition is the second type primary resource here. Tradition, generally speaking, tradition is passed down by word of mouth. It's like a big game of telephone. So if I were to start here with a message, and I were to give it to Jevin, and expect you to go all the way through everybody and come back all the way over here to Kate, would it be the same message? Probably not. Yeah, hopefully, but probably not. So tradition sources, are they going to be accurate? Probably not. So there could be truths, there could be elements of truth within traditional primary sources, but you have to keep in mind that if you hear it by word of mouth, there's probably something that's been adjusted a little bit over the course of time. But it's very important to listen to tradition and to understand tradition to be able to know more about culture, especially in certain parts of the world where they don't have written records and there's not a whole lot of artifacts. Places like Africa, South America, even certain parts of Asia, there's not a lot of written record that we know about. So here's the third type, is written record. This is the most important of all three types of primary sources. Why? There's that question again. Why is that most important? Janai, what do you think? Why is written record more important than the other two? More accurate. You're right. Why is it more accurate? Gabby, why do you think written record is more accurate? than perhaps tradition or artifacts. What do you think? Let's say I give you guys a project, and I'm just going to explain the project. I'm not going to write anything down. I'm not going to put it on Canvas. How many of you are going to end up with questions by the time you get home? Yeah. Why is it better if I write it out on paper or I put it on Canvas? Carter, what do you think?
So that like we know exactly what you want.
You know exactly what I want. You know exactly what I'm thinking, exactly the instructions that are there. Same thing here with written records. We know exactly what the people were thinking. We know exactly what they intended. Now, I know there's some interpretation. Those of you that are English and literature buffs, there's some interpretation there. But written records are going to be the most accurate of all of them. So when we look at these records, there are a few things that we need to do with these primary sources. How to use them. Number one, we need to evaluate them. We need to evaluate them. So as we evaluate, we've got to compare to other sources. I think you guys already do this in English class, but with history, it's important that we don't take just one person's account. We take multiple accounts, if possible. We try to look at a number of things to be able to come to a conclusion. So we're going to evaluate, is this an accurate resource or is it biased? We also want to do some synthesis. What's involved in synthesis? That's a big-time college word. What is synthesis? Take it. Yes. Okay. Yes. So we're going to take our evaluated resources, we're going to compare them, and we're going to treat them almost like a funnel, put them all together, and merge them into an idea of what happened. So we're going to take a number of different ideas, a number of different pieces of information from an evaluation stage. We're going to merge them all together to come up with one big idea of what we think happened. This is where our why question often comes in. So you gather the information. For most of you, that's going to look like I assign a reading in the textbook. That's your evaluation of the sources. Then we come to class, and then I ask, well, why did that happen? I don't know, the textbook said so. You're missing this step right here. Okay? I want you to start thinking, when you read something, why did it happen? We go into synthesis, we gather the information, now we start formulating an idea of why it happened, and then we get to interpretation. Interpretation is when we take those ideas together, we start applying them and we say, okay, here is what we know about these people. Here is the final conclusion to the best of our knowledge and best of our ability. This is our goal, and this is where we want to get to when we're studying history. So we're studying the ancient Egyptians. And we look at the pyramids, and we look at the pharaohs. And we look at their culture, we look at their weapons, and then we start merging that with Scripture and remembering that Joseph was one of the leading rulers in all of Egypt. That is part of what we do in synthesis as we evaluate those couple of sources, synthesis, and then interpretation says, well, man, Joseph must have been a pretty important guy. God must have really been looking out for him to be able to put him in control of that type of empire at the time in history that he was there. Okay, so any questions? Comments?